everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Palavito. I'll be your moderator for today's program. In today's program, we have a very interesting subject we're going to discuss that you've probably seen is the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, or DOGE, depending how you want to look at it. And the thing is, it's going to be headed up by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And the whole idea is to create government efficiency, aka slash the fraud, waste, and abuse that exist in the United States government. They claim, or at least Elon Musk says, you can save $2 trillion, which is a lot of money, by the way, by cutting the federal government. So we need to find somebody who knows a lot about the federal government and knows a lot about the debt, which we're discussed in our show because the big debt is $36 trillion. And that is a guy who's been talking about it for years, but we don't listen. That's the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, who can talk about the big debt and DOGE. So, David, I'm sure you have some opinion on this new government agency, which is not an agency to cut the debt or the deficit, which definitely is a problem. So let us know what we can look forward to in the future with DOGE.
Well, thanks, Nick. First, let's talk about what DOGE is and what it isn't, and then we can take it from there. It's called the Department of Government Efficiency, which is somewhat of a misnomer for several reasons. Number one, it's not a department. It's not even inside the federal government. I mean, candidly, we already have too many departments and agencies. We don't need another one. In reality, it appears to be a expanded and expedited Grace Commission, which occurred during the Reagan administration, where the president appointed a commission of external players to make recommendations to improve the economy, efficiency, and hopefully the effectiveness of government. It is something that will be staffed externally, presumably. It will look at what can be done to look at the organization and operations of government. It would include fraud, waste, abuse, mismanagement. It would include improper payments. It would include duplication, overlap, and redundancy. It would, and a number of different dimensions. In my view, the agency that I used to head, the Government Accountability Office, it should draw very heavily on their work. Whether it be the high risk list, whether it be the transition reports with all the outstanding recommendations they have, whether it be the duplication, overlap, and redundancy reports, whether it be their fraud, waste, and abuse work, if you will. And so they'll also probably draw upon Inspector General's reports as well, which also includes improper payments that are estimated to occur. When they say they're going to save $2 trillion, my question is, over what period of time? Can they save $2 trillion over 10 years? Easily. Can they save $2 trillion in a year? No way. I think if it's properly designed and effectively implemented, they could save several hundred billion a year. And I've got a lot of ideas about how they might be able to do that. And I did meet with some members of the DOGE transition team last Tuesday to talk to them about some of my preliminary thoughts. I expect there'll be some follow-up conversations. But it was almost a little bit humorous when it first got announced, because as I said, the last thing we need is a new department in the government, and having two people as head of something is not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. On the other hand, these are both very bright and capable people with a lot of experience. They're going to need help to understand the differences between the government and the private sector. It's a heck of a lot more difficult to be able to make major transformational change in the government than the private sector. I should know. I've done it in the public, private, not-for-profit sector. And as far as I know, I'm the only person that I know who's actually downsized and transformed an agency in the federal government in the last 25 plus years. So we'll see.
Okay, and with that, we'll bring in our panelists from around the world, and there's quite a few of them here today. First of all, we'll bring in David Kinder from the United States, who I'm sure will have his opinion on this. Kim Calhoun is also from the USA. Adam Lamparero from the USA. Rick Rosner, USA. Shaquille, United Kingdom or Australia. Jatovi, USA, and also Mark Lee from the USA. And let's see, we will start with we'll start with Kevin, because you're right next to me. What are your thoughts
Hey.
about the DOGE Commission?
Well, I've had a lot of experience in the government spending programs and the government bidding system, SAMS.gov. I worked head of the government contracts for some of the corporations that I worked for before I branched out on my own. And I saw a lot of waste in spending. And, Elon, if it weren't for that wasted spending, probably would not have received his $20 billion in grant money that he did for his SpaceX program. So, maybe he saw the same thing I did and he's going, we really need to clean this up. But if, by doing so, he's going to eliminate most of his opportunities. But he's, being head of some of this, it's concerning to me because of a conflict of interest, but the amount of waste is tremendous. If you go into the bidding system, you will see that they will spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to bid out to purchase a tool that they can go right down the street and just buy. So I don't agree with a lot of what goes on in that sector. And they have a rule: if they don't spend it and use more, then they don't get more money next year. And I think all of that needs to change. And I think that people need to be rewarded for operating more efficiently in the departments, not rewarded for overspending. And, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was a big thing about the government programs.
Well, a couple of things real quick, Kim. One, you always ought to look for commercially available options first. And the government has a mindset that, we're different. We need something, that's customized. And I'll give a perfect example of that. When I was Controller General, the Army needed a new vehicle to be able to carry things in, if you will, okay, like a wagon. And they had already built a number of Humvees, so they needed a wagon to attach to the Humvee to be able to carry things around. So it wasn't a weapon. I mean, it was, something to transport things. Rather than going out and looking what might be available commercially, which they didn't do, and given the use it or lose it laws that they had to spend the money by the end of the year, which, by the way, that ought to go, all right? That ought to go. And, they ended up saying, well, we're different. We need to have something designed. So they had something designed. It had two problems. Number one, either it didn't stay hooked to the Humvee, or B, if it did significant damage. So they had thousands of these just stored in a warehouse. Mm-hmm. I named this the War Wagon. Did a board of it, the image of it, and used this as an example of what's wrong with government contracting back when I was Controller General. So you ought to be required to look for commercially available first. There ought to be a very high bar not to go commercially available if something is otherwise available. In addition to that, you ought to get rid of use it or lose it. Absolutely get rid of it.
Thank you.
And frankly, the president needs more impoundment authority. He needs more of an ability to impound money where it looks like it's clear waste. And we also need to make sure that when we're looking at budgets, that any items that were in the budget that were based upon a temporary need or a one-time use need to be cut out of the budget. Because the game that government tries to play is, even if it's one-time money or temporary, they want to build that into the base and get more money off of that, when in reality, it should be taken out of the base. And you ought to have to make a business case for it.
The DOGE policy that's gotten the most coverage so far is they want to get rid of work from home. And people are saying, well, that'll make a lot of government employees quit their jobs. And then other people are saying, well, that's not a bad thing.
Well, my view on that is that first, we already had excess infrastructure in the federal government before COVID. During COVID, there was a massive expansion of work from home, remote work. The current president, President Biden, it's my understanding, ordered earlier in 2024 for feds to come back to work in their facilities, but that has not been enforced. The GAO, which I ran, was way ahead with regard to remote work. We did allow it, but now it's gotten out of hand. Now it's to the point where you have people that are working remotely, most of the time, if not all of the time. My personal view is that people need to work in the office, at least 3 days a week. And
Agree.
that's my personal view. And we'll see what they end up doing. Again, let's reinforce. All these people can do is make recommendations.
Right.
In addition to that, the president can end up issuing executive orders for what applies to the executive branch. He can't do that for the legislative and judicial branches of government.
I want to add something there because of what I did in government contracts, but also just in corporate world and working and everything. And it's way different than when you're your own boss, but use some common sense in your job definitions. If a job really doesn't require a person to come in and they can get more done working from home, less driving on the road, which is less hazards, less gas usage, then use that opportunity and let those people work from home, because there are some people who absolutely cannot. They need to be in laboratories, right? So use some common sense in all of this. Don't force people to go into work that don't have to. And especially if they're people who have been performing better from home. I have people that I know for a fact work better in the office. So, I set up office space for them, and I have people I know better who work better from home. But I think some common sense needs to be put into place. I don't think just direct policies work. I think that, somewhere we need to get common sense back into our military and government.
Yeah, totally.
It's just an input.
My concern, because two questions for you, Dave. By the way, first and foremost, I hope you're doing well today. It's Thanksgiving week and you're not down here. You're invited to Thanksgiving and we're going to have a lot of food, man. You got to come on, Dave.
Thank you, Jacoby. I appreciate that very much.
But my two questions, because DOGE sounds as if it's a redundant office, because I thought the Government Accountability Office was supposed to be doing what DOGE is now supposed to be doing. And then on top of that, the learning curve. How do you think the learning curve is going to go? Because my fear is starting to bubble based on what Elon Musk did, because he did not understand what the job was of one individual and he tried to get that individual fired. He read the word diversification, saw and thought in his mind diversity, and went on some woke tirade on Twitter and tried to dox an employee. Well, that actual employee, the diversification that they were talking about was actually the food supply. So we're not locked into one food supply. So he mistook what the actual job was and tried to get this individual or put this individual in the crosshairs of all of his followers and everybody else. So my concern, and I guess my question is, the learning curve. It seems as if it's going to be a huge learning curve for this new department. What do you feel on that?
Well, several things. One, to date, the only thing that we know is that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are supposed to co-lead this. It is outside of the government, not inside the government. They are asking for volunteers of above average IQ people who are willing to work 80 hours a week for free for a year and a half. It's going to be interesting to see how many people they get to respond to that. But the bottom line is that, as I mentioned before, there's a huge difference between what you can do in the private sector and what you can do in government. And clearly, one of the things they're going to need is they're going to need some people that actually have experience in both. And can help them understand what's feasible and what's not feasible, what should be the relative priorities in this area. there is a fundamental difference between what this group is doing and what GAO does. I mean, first, GAO works for the Congress and the American people. It's in the legislative branch. The president can't tell it what to do. It's independent from the president. Secondly, it can only make recommendations. It doesn't have the authority to force anybody to do anything other than its own employees. And I do think that the GAO will be a wealth of information for the DOGE to help them with regard to come up with ideas. The difference is that the DOGE will have much more of an ability to get directly to the president, on things that they believe needs to be done in order to improve the economy, efficiency, and hopefully the effectiveness of government. And the inspectors general, who, as you know, are in the executive branch, they have a dual reporting line. They report to the agency heads for the departments and agencies they work for, and they also have a dotted line reporting responsibility to the Congress. They do a lot of work that should be helpful to the DOGE, including the improper payments reports that are done every year. So my biggest concern is, how is this thing going to get staffed, and how are they going to be able to have people that actually understand the difference between the government and the private sector with regard to not only what you can do, but how do you have to go about things in order to actually get them accomplished.
Hey, really quickly, I had a question for you because recently, as a matter of fact, it just happened this Friday. Jacoby's aware of it. Other people in Durham and North Carolina are aware of it as well. But the American Rescue Plan had several proposals, and there was actually a stipend that was going to be given to artists of like $5,000 and everything. And it's like 30. So if you add 30 times 5, that's what, $150,000 that they're giving away roughly, and all along those lines and everything. So I do know that a lot of times when the funding takes place, a lot of what gets cut, some people will see as being useless and everything, but for a artist or a musician, that $5,000 can be pretty much like a good portion of their income that they make on a regular basis. So I guess what I'm asking you, Dave, is, are you concerned, or how can you alleviate that concern? Because a lot of times what is cut first is the arts, the sports, and a lot of things, even history, things that people may not consider all that vital, but they can be vital to the development of critical thinking. So how can you, well, that's what my concern is about this Department of Efficiency, is that they might cut something that they see as inefficient, but it might actually serve some valuable purpose. And that's why I use the American Rescue Plan as an example.
Well, first, there's already discussion about whether or not the federal government ought to be subsidizing PBS and certain other outlets. There's already discussion about that. And this isn't the first time that there's been discussion about that. But let me come back and say, again, all these people can do is make recommendations, all right? They don't have the authority to implement anything. And to the extent that it's something that can be done via executive order, then those will have to be put into a separate category for the president to consider. To the extent that it has something to do with appropriations or something that requires legislation, then that will have to be put into a different bucket. You'll have to cooperate with Congress, and they may or may not agree. And in some cases, to the extent that it's something that will require a constitutional amendment, you'll have to decide how are you going to go about trying to get that done. And there's even been discussion about term limits. Now, term limits has nothing to do, as far as I'm concerned, with DOGE. It's a problem. I think we need them, but that will take a constitutional amendment. So I think it's too early, but just understand this, Mark. All they can do is make recommendations. And in many cases, their recommendations are going to require congressional support, but not in all. And I know, two things that I think that really need to be considered. Well, several things. One, line item veto, that will require a constitutional amendment. Okay. And additional impoundment authority, meaning undercut, use it or lose it. You don't have to use it or lose it. If it's a waste of money, then impound the money. Okay. And I think the other thing that is needed is additional reorganization authority. Additional authority for the president to be able to reorganize government. For example, let's take the area of human capital. I would argue the most valuable asset we have are our people, right? And yet we've got a number of different departments and agencies that are working on human capital policy, whether it be the Labor Department, whether it be the education department, whether it be immigration policy. I think one of the things that we need to think about is how can we consolidate some of these things so that we eliminate a lot of overhead. At the same point in time, we're getting people to work together on a more comprehensive and integrated basis to go after the problem. Because one of the things I found is you want to minimize the number of layers, players, and hardened silos. The more layers, the more players, the more hardened silos you have, the more opportunity for duplication, overlap, redundancy, the more application for gaps, the less efficient, that things are. And so that's a fundamental concept that I would hope that they would explore, as I did when I restructured GAO.
That makes a lot of sense. If I can just ask one follow-up, because that's where I was going and everything. And just one quick follow-up. One of the things that was asked, David, even here in Durham, North Carolina, and this was actually done on a local level and everything, with this notion there are a lot of creatives that are out there, and sometimes these creatives are not able to have a sustainable income. So there was even the notion before the pandemic of creating like a fund that would help the creatives right here in Durham. Unfortunately, the pandemic came around, so that I don't think went anywhere, even though that may come back out now that we are slowly and further coming out of the pandemic. So I just wondered, do you think that that's something that might be looked at or that you would approve of and everything? Because there are a lot of people around the world that are various creatives and that could be everything from advertising to artists and musicians, but they don't always have the income that they need. So what the local government was thinking about doing was creating a fund that these people could tap into, but it was going to be done locally, not nationally.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, one of the things that also has to be considered by DOGE is devolution. In other words, there may be needs. The question is, at what level of government should those needs be addressed? Should it be a federal level? Should it be a state level? Should it be a local level? Because the truth is, the federal government has grown dramatically, far beyond what the founders intended for the federal government. I mean, the federal government was created by the states, not the other way around. And yet, when you look at the expansion of government, I mean, for example, the federal government is almost 10 times bigger today than it was in 1913, almost 10 times bigger. And when you look at what the federal government is doing as compared to the preamble of the Constitution, you'll find that most of the things that it's doing aren't in the preamble of the Constitution. That doesn't mean you're going to eliminate them all, okay? But the things that are in the preamble of the Constitution, like provide for the common defense, ensure justice, if you will, those things are in the shrinking part of the budget. Those things are in what's called discretionary spending, which now is only about 27% of the budget and getting squeezed year by year.
David Kender.
So I had a couple of thoughts here. First, I love the idea of challenging the $75,000 proverbial toilet seats. We want to get rid of that kind of spending, that's for sure. The way that Musk has approached Twitter is apparently 20% of what it used to be. He reduced it by 80% because they changed the focus of that organization. Trump, as a developer, we know about him and Roman Wink. He solved that in 3.5 months, $750,000 under budget, when it took the government 6 years and $12 million. So I like the mindset behind what they're trying to do, but what I'm hoping for is more of the movie Dave. They had that meeting there, and they figured out what's important here, what can be cut. Is this important? And so I want to see him cut the fat and prudently deploy, and then figure everything else. Now, and of course, you reminded me here is that this is a recommendations committee, because I was wondering about this, because Vivek went on Twitter or whatever else he went on to, and he said that this is only an 18-month commission, but I'm like, but I'm thinking about, like, if you've got a family that's addicted to spending and you reformat all of their finances and everything, and you don't change behavior, what's going to happen afterwards? They're going to get right into the same mess as before. And I'm thinking about those term limits. I'm thinking about, whoever is the administration that's in power, they've got their own agendas. What's going to prevent them from overspending again in the future after all of this efficiency comes about, if it does come about? So there's a lot of things I've got in mind on that.
That's interesting. If you go to the website for my book, which also has a lot of my op-eds and some videos on it, which is American2040.com, you'll find that the latest op-ed that was just posted up there, as I recall at the top of my head, the title is, that DOGE is needed, but it's not enough. Okay, so my view is that, as I said, if DOGE goes about this the right way, and if the recommendations that make sense are implemented, because there's a difference between strategy and implementation, and how you go about that makes a big difference. That's one of the things they need to understand. The differences between government and the private sector. You talk about X. I mean, Elon owned X. Elon was chairman and CEO. Elon didn't have unions. Elon didn't have, didn't have the rights that civil servants have. I mean, there are just so many differences between the public sector and the private sector that they're going to have to consider. That even if you implement all the things that are worthwhile that they come up with, that may give you several $100 billion a year, but we got a $2 trillion deficit every year. So we're going to need to be able to have a statutory commission that will put things on the table that they're not going to address. Social insurance programs, defense and other spending, programs. Okay. Tax policy, things that really by definition require legislation and require a major citizen education and engagement effort, because it goes far beyond fraud-based waste, abuse, and mismanagement. I mean, these are fundamental policy decisions on what the federal government ought to do, rather than how does it do business. And they should be focused more on how do you do business. And the other thing we need is that we need a constitutional amendment that limits the ability of Congress to continue to mortgage the future of our country, our kids, our grandkids, and future generations. And so we need all three of those things. DOGE is a good start, but it's not enough by itself.
Yes, Shaquille.
Sorry. And sorry for my abrupt departure. I'll just tell you what's happened. We can compare it to government services. So I heard an almighty bang. Thankfully, I was muted on here. And it was somebody's tyre had popped, and they crashed into my neighbour's new Mercedes-Benz, which he's only just picked up a few days ago. So we called the police, just let them know what had happened. They sent an ambulance. There was nobody hurt. The tow trucks, though, the police have just showed up now, 10 minutes after it's happened. The tow trucks got there in 3 minutes. I don't know where they came from, but there was 3 tow trucks for a 2-car accident in 3 minutes. So I think that explains a lot between private enterprise and government. Look, I think, you made mention that I live in the UK and Australia. I don't live in either of those countries. I live in Switzerland and Ireland, and I spend a lot of my other time in Dubai. And it's very interesting when I look at different governments. Now, it's an unfair comparison, but when I'm in Dubai, if I need something done, I can get it done very, very quickly. The government's very, very active in encouraging businesses to thrive. Switzerland is very bureaucratic, but it still can be done very quickly. They're still very open, especially in the finance sector. Ireland is also a lot more bureaucratic, but there is nothing that I have seen in any major country that is as bureaucratic and as complex as interacting with the US government. And that does a few things. It causes a lot of business entrepreneurs to look at other countries, even if they're American, to look at other countries to register their business. If it's not a business that it needs to physically be located in the US, you look elsewhere, and that's some of the damage that gets done. As for government spending, I'm quite cognizant of the union action that was just recently happening on the ports. One of the things that they insisted on was not just a pay increase over the next handful of years, but also that there would be no introduction of AI to make those ports more efficient. Now, I can tell you that that's probably very similar with ports in a lot of other countries, but I think for a great deal of countries, especially ones that are growing, if they can create ports and take advantage of new technologies to drive efficiency, that's absolutely what they're going to do. So my concern is that it's not just going to be more efficient spending, but what is the government going to do about the extremely large amount of employees that they have, and how they're going to deal with unions who are going to oppose any kind of cut to those employees in numbers.
Yeah, Jatovia and then Rick.
I guess I'd like to hear an answer to Shaq's question as well, because Shaq actually had a good point about how it's all going to come together. But Dave, I'd like to get back to one of your other concerns, which is also another concern of mine, is if this is a voluntary thing, evidently, and that's where the staffing is going to come from, how is this not going to turn out to be a direct line of communication directly to Trump, because he's a transactional individual and he has buddies in these in these different businesses, and they jump onto that commission free of charge to have an ear to the actual individual that they're trying to basically negotiate with or curry favor with. So how does DOGE not just become that, basically, where you have these rich individuals going there?
Well, I think you're raising a question: is exactly how is it going to be staffed, and what are some of the ethical and conflict of interest issues that are associated with it? I don't think they've dotted those I's and crossed those T's yet, but they have at least acknowledged that their recommendations are likely to be made to the Office of Management and Budget, which is where I think they ought to be made, who can then put them into buckets. What is theoretically possible through executive order? What would require legislation? What would require a constitutional amendment? And they would be the intermediary between the DOGE and the president. Okay, I know that that a lot of these details just haven't been worked out yet, and frankly, they need to be worked out. But I come back to what I said before. All these people can do is make recommendations. The recommendations need to be filtered by category: what's feasible, what's not feasible. On the unions issue, the most unionized sector of our economy is the government. That's the only sector of the economy where unions are actually growing. In most sectors of the economy, unions are going down. Unions didn't used to be allowed in the federal government. In fact, FDR was adamantly opposed to unionization of federal employees, but JFK allowed it starting in the early 60s. But there are important differences between what unions can do in the public sector and the private sector. Unions cannot negotiate over pay and benefits in the public sector, but they can negotiate over work rules. And that's where the issue that was recently mentioned about automation, AI, uses of new technology, I clearly think that's on the table. And I think it needs to be on the table. And so that's an example of where there may be some union opposition. At the same point in time, there are limits as to what unions can do in the federal sector.
Rick Rossner.
That could be an example of where they try to get legislation that reinforces what they want to do, which means the Congress would have to participate, and which would override any ability the unions might have to try to be able to stall it if they can get legislation on it.
So I just want to talk about Twitter, where Musk cut the workforce by 80%. He also cut the value of the company by 75%. Twitter used to be fun. I like writing jokes. I like reading jokes, and that's used to be what Twitter was for me. All those people left, and now Twitter is a miserable experience, highly politicized, and bad for advertisers. That's why the market value dropped, because it's so politicized, advertisers don't like using it anymore.
Well, the royal family of the Middle East, I think it's Qatar or Jordan or somebody who put money into Twitter, doesn't agree with that valuation. I'll just remind you that as a private company, it's much harder to value. So these are people say the values drop. That may not be the case. Your criticism of what Twitter is today, the criticism before was that other people found it too political, the other side. So my concern, David, with the Department of Government Efficiency is that there could be a tendency for them to just cut budgets instead of saying, hey, this item that you want to buy, why are you paying $10,000 for it when you can get it for $2,000? I do feel that could be some sort of cause for concern. But what I do like about it is, I think actually what I like about it is what Jacoby is concerned about. What I like about it is actually bringing people who are business people into some kind of government, quasi-government agency. And I like that idea because I think that career bureaucrats and career politicians don't have a lot of real world experience a lot of the time. Many times they were quite young when they tried to enter into politics. They might have law degrees and public policy degrees and that sort of stuff, political science degrees, but they don't have an awful lot of experience in actually running businesses and knowing how hard that is for small businesses and even for large businesses, knowing some of the challenges between driving long-term growth if you're a director of a company and you're receiving your remuneration in options over the company's stock. Do you want that short-term growth to for the next quarterly financials, or are you looking for that longer-term growth, which may actually eventuate after you're no longer a director? So there is always a balancing act that different people have to play, and I think that having diversity of experience in government, or at least interacting with government, would actually be quite good. And I'll just lastly say that there are a number of countries, especially in Europe and in Asia, that actually invite people who are not government in to be able to influence how government's going to interact.
Jacoby?
Just to clarify, that already happens in the U.S. where every president does bring in a group of individuals from different sections of the business world to do that. My concern again is it's not this volunteer office is not reaching down to the franchise owner of a local Chick-fil-A to find out what's going on in that neck of the world. What that government, that DOGE office seems to be aimed at, which is, again, my big fear, and I hope I'm wrong, is that those individuals like an Elon Musk, like the owner of PayPal, Peter Thiel, like the owner of these top level individuals that do not have access to these lower level areas, but are going to volunteer so that business itself can actually get some type of benefit. Hence the reason why, for example, a big positive for Elon Musk, he was having troubles with cutting red tape for different programs that he's doing with SpaceX, with Tesla, with the self-driving cars. There's an issue there with self-driving cars, but he wants to cut that regulation. So now he has access to go ahead and cut that regulation around self-driving cars so that he could actually put these cars out there and also cut back on the EV benefits that were benefiting all other dealers. But he is the number one EV dealer in the U.S., so he has less competition to deal with cutting around that. There's a whole shebang or a whole thing that we can get into around that. But again, it goes back to my issue around that DOGE office. Who's going to be in there volunteering? What companies are going to be tied to it? Which Dave expressed perfectly about the ethics around it. That is, again, that's my big concern.
All right, question for David. How optimistic or pessimistic are you now with 2 months to go compared to 2016 with 2 months before Trump takes office?
Oh, I think Trump is better positioned now than he was in 2016. One, he won a much more convincing victory than he did in 2016. Secondly, he's got the experience of his first term in office to know what worked and what didn't work. Thirdly, he's already named all of his cabinet officials and a number of other key players. Now, I think some of those cabinet officials are going to have a tough time getting confirmed. We can talk about that if you want, but I think, and personally, I have a concern about trying to push cabinet level officials through on a recess appointment, especially if they're controversial cabinet officials, if you will. I would hope that the DOGE will end up focusing on systemic changes, what needs to be done in order to improve economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in a systemic manner. Okay. We've talked about some of those things earlier. And as a general principle, we want more competition, not less competition. And that should be a fundamental principle that they're dealing with. And as another example is, we want more commercially available options, not fewer commercially available options. Okay, and there's still going to be, there's still going to be ethics rules and conflict rules and acquisition rules that will apply, post adoption of any recommendations with regard to actual money that ends up taxpayer money that actually gets spent, whether it be for products or services. They will still apply.
Mark Lee.
Yeah, first a quick commercial, because we do have a bookstore here, and the bookstore does have David Walker's book there and all along those lines. So definitely you can check that out. Jacoby mentioned transactional individuals and Trump being transactional, and one of our recent guests, Steve Robinson, actually wrote a book that's also on the Pod TV bookstore called Turf Wars, because he actually took on Donald Trump at the time that he was a major developer in New York, along with a band of activists. So that was my quick Pod TV bookstore online commercial that I just plugged in everything. But my question for you, Dave, and everything along those lines is, you mentioned it, which of the appointments, particularly those that are economic appointments, are you quite pleased with? Because I know he just named somebody for Treasury Secretary. And which ones do you have concerns about yourself and everything when it comes to appointments that are economically centered, for lack of a better term?
Well, I mean, I don't know a lot of these people well, so I really don't want to, say that I think they're good or bad or whatever. I will say this, that I think that the appointment to the Department of Office of Management and Budget may have some confirmation challenges. And the reason that I say that is that while it's the same individual that was the director of the Office of Management and Budget for Trump during his first term, he's associated with two things that are highly controversial. Number one, Project 2025. He had a key role with regard to Project 2025, which Trump said he had nothing to do with, and yet this guy's being appointed as head of OMB, which, as I said before, is a key position, especially with regard to DOGE. And secondly, he also is the primary advocate of Schedule F. And what is Schedule F? It's basically, converting the status of civil servants, into who are engaged in policy into a different category where they become at-will employees, and you can get rid of them at will. Now, I mean, look, there are pros and cons to these different things, but I know that those are two very controversial things. Let me mention, we don't want to do transactional things here. We want to do transformational things here. All right. And one of the things that I have in my latest op-ed, which again is on American2040.com, is we don't have a plan as a country. We don't have a strategic plan, economic, diplomatic, military, social, etc. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's how we measure success in outcome-based terms. How are we doing? Are we getting better or worse? How do we compare to our competitor or comparator groups, if you will? We don't have key national indicators. And those are things that I think are absolutely critical in order to not just get the benefit of whatever the one-time decisions are that are made through DOGE, but to fundamentally change the culture of government. What is it doing? How does it measure success? And to then change our performance metrics, whether it be at the institutional level or the individual level, to focus energy and efforts on achieving desired outcomes. Because the general nature of government is just more. And if something's not working, we need more. When in reality, in many cases, you're throwing good money after bad, or you've got one part of government working against another part of government, or you've got a spending program that's supposed to be accomplishing something, but then a tax policy that's having the opposite effect. I mean, we need to bring some fundamental management 101 principles to government that have not been brought there and that go far beyond transactional. These are transformational things not transactional things.
Speaking of that, just really quickly, and I did see David and Jacoby, so I'll turn it over to them after this, but how worried are you about what appears to be conflicts of interest? Because one of the things that I mentioned on World Edition is that apparently this new head of FDA has also got ties to a weight loss drug and everything. So that to me sounds like a automatic conflict of interest and everything. So I was just wondering, how concerned are you about these
Well,
conflicts of
There's
interest?
been that revolving door from corporate to government executives for decades, hasn't there?
Well, anybody who is a federal government employee, whether they be political or whether they be career, will have to comply with applicable conflict of interest rules and ethics requirements. That can have an impact on what they're able to invest in. That can have an impact on what activities they can be involved in decision making. I mean, I'll give you an example. Okay, I'm considered a special government employee as a member of the Defense Business Board. The Defense Business Board can only make recommendations. We can't implement it, which is kind of similar to DOGE. The difference is we're inside of government, all right? And I'm a special government employee. I can't work more than 60 days a year on Department of Defense matters under the basic rules. And the basic rules say that I have to disclose all my investments, I have to disclose all my relationships, all right? And I cannot be involved in anything that could be a direct or perceived conflict of interest, but I don't have to divest or disassociate myself, all right? As long as I limit the amount of time, and as long as I'm transparent, and as long as I do recuse myself on matters that otherwise
Does that mean you can't own a few thousand shares in Lockheed Martin or something like that?
No, it does not mean that. Okay, it does not mean that. On the other hand, if I'm spending more time, then there are more restrictions. And if I was a full-time government employee, I think if I was Deputy Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Defense, I think there would be a problem, holding Lockheed Martin stock. Okay. I think there would be. Now, sometimes people get around these things by putting their money in blind trusts, where they lose control over their investments, and they're not told what they're investing in. But bottom line, the DOGE is outside of government, so that means it's not subject to the same rules. All right. One of the things I thought they might try to do is to give it an official recognition and allow people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to work up to 60 days a year and have these less restrictive items apply to them. But as of now, they're planning to keep it outside of government. That may change over time, but we'll see.
Just real quick, the thing is that we keep talking about conflicts of interest between government and business. Let's not forget the conflict of interest within government to try to justify their existence. And they're going to try to do things. They've been playing games. For example, think of whoever's doing fraud management in Medicare, Medicaid, and all the other stuff. There's a vested interest to keep that department there to preserve their position. So there's a vested interest to kind of keep some of that fraud going at some level, so that they can create headlines that says, hey, I've made a difference. So there's always some conflict of interest somewhere. And the thing is that there's going to be far more of a movement to justify their existence and say, yes, I do matter. Yes, I should do this stuff. And yes, keep me here because I'm justifying my existence because I'm doing X, Y, and Z. So I always see that as part of any kind of regulations.
Obviously, to the extent that you're talking about downsizing government, the people who could be affected by that downsizing obviously have a conflict, right? And one of the things that I think Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to need to understand, as I found out in the agencies that I ran, is when you're talking about doing those kinds of things, you really have to look at functions, activities, footprint, and layers of management, all right? Where if you're eliminating something, you're eliminating based on those criteria. Because if you try to eliminate based on merit, a vast majority of the performance appraisal systems in the federal government are worthless. and therefore the ability to be able to make decisions on merit is either totally undercut or severely constrained. And so that's another example of where I said you need to make systemic changes. I mean, the human capital policies of the federal government, and particularly the performance measurement systems, all right, and the ability to deal with people who aren't performing, that has to be modernized, okay? And that's something that doesn't just apply to this administration, it applies forever, okay? And that's something that, you know, is going to have to be done. So they're going to have to be able to do everything they can based upon the current environment, but there are things that need to be done that will be able to facilitate more informed decisions in the future when new systems and processes are put in place that will allow for more flexibility in making merit-based decisions.
Jacoby?
I just have to disagree a little with the idea that that the fraud, that there has to be some fraud or someone has to create fraud to justify their position to stay there. That is similar to saying the only reason we have crime still is because police are around. So I have to push back on that. That I think and Dave, I think you put it better because I think there is a lot of inefficiency there. That there's enough work to go around. So it's not the fact that they're creating extra fraud. It's just there's a lot of issues that are within government that need to be adjusted and fixed and need to be worked with.
Well, and one example, Jacoby, on that is one part of government doesn't communicate with another part of government.
Yes.
Okay. In addition to that, the internal controls that are in place, in many cases, they'll pay things out before they've verified things. An example of that is when you end up having a lot of things being paid to people who are dead because there's not adequate communication between the Social Security Administration and others with regard to deaths. So again, I come back and say you want to minimize the layers, players, silos, systems, and layers of management, because the more you have, the more inefficient you're going to be. We should have zero tolerance for fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, but it will never, ever, ever be zero. But there's a lot of things that we can do to make it a lot better than what it is right now.
Shaquille?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Just on that example you used, Jacoby, that's the argument I hear from progressives about private prisons encouraging people to be locked up. So, but my concern is also with government efficiency. The two main concerns. One is where one government department is paying for people to do something that another government department's paying for them not to do. And the farmers are a great example of that, where farmers are paid to grow crops and other farmers are paid to destroy crops. We've just recently had a report come out in Australia that because of a quirk in how the subsidy program works, some farmers are actually better off not growing anything at all rather than actually planting a seed. And that is ridiculous, and it should never happen. Now, it wasn't how the program was designed. Obviously, it wasn't how the program was designed. But if you happen to own a farm and you're going to earn the same amount or more money by not growing anything, why would you take on the risk of actually planting seeds? So clearly, that's somewhere that we need to address. But the last thing I'll just quickly say about government inefficiency in non-financial terms. If we look back throughout history, we've seen a couple of examples of this, and one was the competition in the railroad industry, where the complaint from the public was that the sum total of individual trips could sometimes be, or that a longer trip could sometimes be cheaper than the subtotal of the shorter trips. So they said, okay, well, why is that? Well, obviously because there's more competition on those shorter trips. So they set up an agency to try to drive competition into that market. And the effect was not to reduce the price of the overall trip. The effect of it was to allow the railway companies to increase their prices. And after having achieved a harmonization of the price, all of those activists then went over to another department and then they tackled the next industry. So I think And that's one of the risks that you'll have with something like the Department of Government Efficiency or other types of government initiatives like that, is that there needs to be some sort of test that the intended purpose and the intended outcome is actually happening, as opposed to just, accepting unintended consequences.
And that comes back to something that I mentioned before. What are we trying to accomplish, and how do we measure success in outcome-based terms? That should not just be an issue for the executive branch. It should also be an issue for the legislative branch. When they're creating a new program, okay, when they're conducting oversight, when they're doing appropriations, where they're doing reauthorizations, they need to be saying, why did we create this? What were we trying to accomplish? And how are they doing based upon those factors? I think another factor we need to think about is it's not just direct spending, okay? It's also indirect spending. We spend, $6 to $7 trillion directly on mandatory and discretionary spending, but we lose $1.8 trillion a year in revenues from deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions. And yet, in many cases, we could be working at cross purposes. For example, we're trying to do what we can to hold healthcare costs down with regard to direct spending. On the other hand, one of the largest tax preferences in the Internal Revenue Code is that individuals never pay income tax or payroll taxes on employer-provided and paid healthcare. It's hundreds of billions a year, which fuels healthcare cost increases because it undercuts incentives, transparency, and accountability mechanisms. And so, we need to take a more comprehensive and integrated approach. DOGE can only do so much in a year and a half. And in some cases, what it may have to do is to make recommendations of other things that need to be done beyond its lifespan.
But I think a lot of the conversation here is about the financial performance and financial things here. What about the things that are much harder to measure? So you brought up healthcare. One of the complaints that have been brought up about the FDA for several decades now is that the FDA is reluctant to pass through to clear a drug to be released to the public. Now, it's very difficult to measure those people whose lives would have been saved or who would have had their conditions relieved by those pharmaceuticals had they been deemed safe earlier in the process. What's much more easy to prove is that the FDA approved a drug, say a thalidomide, for example, and it had this catastrophic effect. So when it comes to efficiency, I think there's also non-financial efficiencies. There's efficiencies where government regulations can cause the business community to end up spending more money than they otherwise should. So I think that non-financial efficiency also needs to be addressed. How much paperwork is there? What's the process here? And is there the potential that we could be missing out on something that we can't measure because it never happened?
It's kind of the opportunity cost. I mean, you have to keep in mind the culture in government in general, and there are always exceptions. It's very risk averse. It's very risk averse, and
we're running out of time. And we would like to thank the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, and our elite panelists to discuss a very important change in our government institutions, which will be DOGE, which we'll see if they meet their goals by, I think it's July 4th, 2026.
Our 250th birthday.
Yeah, we'll see what
which
happens.
I plan to be there for July 4th, 2026.
We ought to have
We'll be tracking them on the Pod TV network.
But I will just tease you Americans, your 250th birthday is actually 250 years after 1783 because you didn't actually become independent in 1776. You had to have a little war first to get to the UK. But we'll let that slide for now.
We'll have a second. We'll have a second.
We'll have a second birthday. We don't have any problem with that.
I'll be there for that too then.
Next week. Bye-bye.